Some of the most shocking secrets in history were never meant to be uncovered. But once the truth came out, it changed everything. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on hidden scandals, unbelievable discoveries, and jaw-dropping stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew. For decades, the whispers surrounded Cary Grant like smoke. Never solid, never confirmed, yet impossible to escape. He was one of Hollywood's greatest leading men. A man whose charm, wit, and sophistication defined the golden age of cinema. Yet behind the tuxedos and silver screen romances, rumors followed him relentlessly. Questions about who he truly loved, and whether the carefully constructed image the studio sold the world was hiding a very different reality. For years, his only child, Jennifer Grant, stayed silent. She was protective of her father's memory and wary of the sensationalism that often clung to his name. But recently, she finally broke that silence, and in doing so, shifted how the world views one of the most iconic stars in film history. The moment came in a rare sit-down conversation, where Jennifer, now in her late 50s, was pressed about the speculation that had never gone away. For a long time, she'd deflected questions with the kind of grace her father was known for. But this time was different. Her tone carried both exhaustion and resolve. She admitted that keeping so much hidden for so long had taken its toll, not only on her but on how her father's story had been told. When the interviewer asked directly about Cary Grant's rumored relationship with fellow actor Randolph Scott, Jennifer paused. The weight of decades hung in that silence. Finally, she said what countless people had only guessed. Her father's connection with Scott wasn't just another Hollywood rumor. It was real, meaningful, and most importantly, it was lived openly. At least for a time. That revelation hit like a shockwave. For years, old photographs of Cary and Randolph lounging by the pool, cooking in the kitchen, or playfully posing in their shared home had been dismissed as studio publicity stunts. Hollywood executives at the time were infamous for staging such images to downplay gossip while secretly keeping their stars in line. But Jennifer's words reframed everything. The photos weren't staged lies. They were snapshots of a genuine relationship that had survived against impossible odds in an industry built on illusion. Jennifer spoke carefully, refusing to sensationalize. She didn't paint her father as a victim or a scandal, but as a man navigating an era when authenticity was dangerous. He loved deeply, she explained, but he also lived in a world that didn't allow him to love openly. Her voice, tinged with both admiration and sadness, reminded listeners that Cary Grant's silence wasn't cowardice, it was survival. And with that admission, she opened a door that had been locked for nearly half a century. If Randolph Scott wasn't an exception, but rather a great love, what did that mean about the other men who had moved through Cary's life? What about the relationships hidden in diaries, the companions pushed aside by studio pressure, or the whispers from fellow actors who claimed to have seen the truth firsthand? Her revelation was more than gossip fodder, it was an act of reclamation. Cary Grant, the man who had defined romance for generations of moviegoers, was finally being recognized, not as the character Hollywood needed him to play, but as the person he truly was, complex, vulnerable, and longing for love like anyone else. And as Jennifer's voice softened near the end of the interview, she offered a simple truth. My father wanted to be remembered for the joy he brought people. But I think the greatest joy for him was love, even if the world never saw it the way he lived it. When Jennifer Grant finally confirmed what many had whispered for years, the name that kept resurfacing was Randolph Scott. To most of Hollywood, Scott was just another rugged leading man, tall, handsome, and cast in countless westerns. But to Cary Grant, he was something far more profound. Their story didn't begin in gossip columns or staged photographs. It began quietly, almost innocently, On the set of Hot Saturday in 1932, two rising stars, both under studio contract, met in the rush of early fame. No one could have predicted that their encounter would grow into one of the longest and most intimate relationships of Cary's life. By the mid-1930s, Grant and Scott had done something almost unthinkable in Hollywood. They moved in together. The two bachelors shared a lavish home in Santa Monica, a beachside villa that quickly became infamous in the tabloids as the Bachelor Hall. To outsiders, it was sold as a quirky arrangement. Just two young men cutting costs in the expensive world of stardom. But to those who visited, the truth was harder to ignore. They lived like spouses. Friends remembered dinner parties filled with laughter, shared vacations, and even the small domestic rituals. Scott making coffee, Cary preparing breakfast, that revealed a bond deeper than friendship. It wasn't long before the cameras caught on. Photographs of the two men lounging shirtless by the pool, sunbathing together, or exchanging knowing glances began circulating. For the public, it was playful. For Paramount, it was dangerous. This was an era when even the hint of homosexuality could destroy a career overnight. Studio executives launched a carefully orchestrated campaign to downplay the rumors. Publicists planted stories of supposed romances with actresses, while photographers were invited to capture staged dates. Yet the pictures of Cary and Randolph at home told a different story, one that couldn't be controlled so easily. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Studio bosses delivered an ultimatum. Cary could continue his career as a leading man, but only if he distanced himself from Scott. Hollywood could tolerate bachelor antics, but not two men building a life together. The demand tore at Grant. After more than a decade of companionship, he chose survival. Friends later recalled the heartbreaking moment when Cary packed his belongings quietly in the night, leaving without warning. Randolph woke to find the house half empty, his partner gone. Within weeks, Scott entered into a hasty marriage with heiress Marion DuPont, a union widely regarded as a cover-up rather than a romance. Still, the bond between them never fully disappeared. Even years later, they were spotted dining together, their eyes betraying a familiarity that no studio contract could erase. For Cary, the split was both a professional necessity and a personal wound. It was proof that in Hollywood, love was not only forbidden, it was punishable. Jennifer Grant would later acknowledge the significance of her father's relationship with Randolph Scott. While she carefully chose her words, her message was unmistakable. This was not a fling or a passing friendship. It was love, lived as openly as the times would allow, then forced back into the shadows. And in that silence, Cary learned a painful truth, that in Hollywood, image was everything, and authenticity was the one luxury even stars couldn't afford. But as tragic as their separation was, it was only one chapter in a larger story. Because after Randolph Scott, Cary Grant's secret world of forbidden loves would only grow more complex and more dangerous. If Cary Grant's relationship with Randolph Scott felt like a marriage hidden in plain sight, his connection with Jerome Zerbe was something else entirely. Secretive, daring, and steeped in the very glamour that made Hollywood sparkle. Zerbe wasn't a fellow actor. He was a photographer, one of the first to master what would become known as celebrity photography. He didn't just capture the stars. He lived among them, drinking champagne in their suites, sailing on their yachts, and documenting the lives the public was never supposed to see. That was precisely what made his relationship with Cary Grant so electrifying and so dangerous. The two men met in the early 1930s, when Zerbe was at the height of his career, flitting between New York society parties and Hollywood premieres. Unlike Scott, who embodied the rugged, masculine archetype studios adored, Zerbe was flamboyant, witty, and unapologetically himself. He thrived in the very circles where Cary longed to be free, places where rules bent, where queerness was not only tolerated but celebrated behind closed doors. To Grant, who had been carefully groomed into Hollywood's ideal leading man, Zerbe represented escape. Together, they slipped into a hidden world of speakeasies, private clubs, and rooftop soirees, where Cary could drop the facade and simply exist. Zerbe introduced him to the thrill of secrecy, a double life where the public saw one version of Cary Grant, while a privileged few witnessed the man behind the mask. But secrecy has a cost. Unlike the warm domesticity of Bachelor Hall with Randolph Scott, Cary's time with Zerbe was marked by constant risk. Zerbe, after all, carried a camera everywhere, and the idea of a single photograph falling into the wrong hands terrified the studios. Publicly, Zerbe dismissed the idea of anything romantic, joking in interviews about the closeness of his friendships with famous men. Privately, he was more candid. He kept diaries, filled with coded entries that hinted at something deeper between himself and Cary. Notes about nights spent together, whispered conversations, and stolen moments away from the flashbulbs. For Cary, the danger was suffocating. Hollywood's studio system had already forced him to abandon Scott. And now, even the perception of a relationship with someone like Zerbe could destroy everything. Still, he couldn't resist the intoxicating pull. Zerbe gave him something he had been denied for years: freedom, if only for a night. And yet, like so many of Cary's relationships with men, this too ended in shadows. The pressures of fame, the relentless watch of studio executives, and Cary's growing fear of exposure drove them apart. Zerbe moved on, continuing his glittering life among the rich and powerful, while Cary retreated further into the carefully constructed facade that the world demanded. But Zerbe's presence left a lasting mark. Unlike Scott, whose love story with Cary was buried under domestic normalcy, Zerbe represented something more radical: the possibility of living openly, even defiantly, in a world built on silence. In his diaries and his photographs, fragments of that truth remain, like ghostly evidence of a life Cary could never fully claim. For audiences of the time, Cary Grant was the picture of perfection. Suave, charming, every woman's fantasy. But behind the curtain, his heart had already been shaped by forbidden love, twice over, and the story was far from finished. Because soon, Cary would be drawn into another entanglement, one with an actress whose public role was to erase his secrets, while quietly confirming them. By the mid-1930s, Cary Grant's private life was becoming a problem, not just for him, but for the powerful men who controlled his career. Hollywood was built on image, and Cary's image was worth millions. He was handsome, charming, a leading man destined to sweep women off their feet on screen. But whispers were already swirling. The stories of Bachelor Hall with Randolph Scott, the nights spent in Jerome Zerbe's world of glittering excess, all of it was beginning to leak into gossip columns. For the studio executives who had invested heavily in Cary Grant, the solution was simple. He needed a wife. Enter Virginia Cherrill. To the public, Virginia was a rising actress in her own right, best known as the blind flower girl in Charlie Chaplin's City Lights. She was beautiful, elegant, and came from money, the perfect Hollywood match. To the studios, she offered something even more valuable: a shield. A marriage between Cary Grant and Virginia Cherrill would silence the rumors, redirect the gossip, and cement his image as a heterosexual leading man. The two met through the Hollywood social circuit, and by 1934, their whirlwind romance had become official. On the surface, it was a fairy tale. Cary Grant, the dashing actor, marrying a glamorous starlet. The headlines practically wrote themselves. But behind the cameras, the marriage was rocky from the very beginning. Virginia, unlike Randolph Scott or Jerome Zerby, wasn't part of Cary's secret world. She was his cover. And while she played her role with grace, the reality was far more complicated. Cary was moody, often distant, and their arguments became legendary. Virginia would later recall how Cary's temper and paranoia wore on her. How he would accuse her of being unfaithful even as he struggled with his own identity. The press, of course, painted a different picture. They ran glowing stories about their glamorous lifestyle. The dinners, the premieres, the vacations. But those close to the couple knew the truth. This was not a marriage built on love. It was a contract. One that served Hollywood more than it served the people inside it. And Hollywood was watching. At the time, lavender marriages, unions designed to protect actors from rumors about their sexuality, were common in the industry. Studios demanded them, careers depended on them. For Cary, marrying Virginia was less about passion and more about survival. He couldn't afford scandal, not when he was still climbing the ladder of stardom. The marriage lasted only a year. By 1935, Virginia filed for divorce, citing mental cruelty. She told friends that Cary was controlling and volatile, prone to jealousy and dark moods. Cary, for his part, claimed he had been betrayed, but privately he was relieved. The experiment had failed, and both of them knew it. But failure in love didn't mean failure for his image. In fact, the divorce worked in Cary's favor. To the public, it painted him as the wounded, misunderstood leading man. Unlucky in romance, but still every woman's dream. Studio executives leaned into that narrative, pushing him into even more romantic roles. Ironically, the collapse of his marriage only made him more desirable on screen. Still, the scars of that union ran deep. For Cary, it was a painful reminder of the compromises he was forced to make in order to maintain his career. For Virginia, it was the role of a lifetime, one she never auditioned for but played anyway. She faded from the Hollywood spotlight soon after, while Cary soared to superstardom. And yet, the timing of that marriage, so brief and so calculated, left behind questions that linger to this day. Was Virginia simply a pawn in Hollywood's carefully orchestrated game? Or did she too know more than she ever let on about the man she briefly called her husband? What we do know is this: Cary Grant walked away from the marriage with his career intact, his reputation shielded, and his secrets still hidden. But the cracks were starting to show. Behind the polished smile and the charming laugh, Cary was growing tired of living a double life, and soon he would be drawn back into a relationship that looked a lot like the past, but carried even higher stakes. Cary Grant's short-lived marriage to Virginia Cherrill might have ended in divorce, but to the men running Hollywood, it had done its job. The public believed Cary was just another unlucky-in-love leading man, the kind who couldn't quite hold on to a woman, but who still set hearts racing in every theater. For Paramount and later Columbia, that image was priceless, and they would do whatever it took to protect it. Hollywood, in the 1930s and 1940s, was not just an entertainment industry. It was a machine, finely tuned to churn out stars and stories. Nothing, not even the truth, could be allowed to derail it. And for actors like Cary Grant, the studios acted as both benefactors and jailers. The whispers about Bachelor Hall, about Cary's closeness with Randolph Scott, about his nights at Jerome Zerby's parties, they never completely went away. Gossip columnists, particularly the notorious Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, sniffed around constantly, but the studios were experts at control. They cultivated relationships with the press, trading stories, burying scandals, and feeding the public carefully crafted lies. If a reporter hinted too loudly at Cary's unconventional lifestyle, suddenly that same reporter would find themselves gifted with an exclusive story on another star. A scandalous affair, a drunken meltdown, anything juicier that would distract the public. The studios treated secrets like currency, and Cary's was one of the most closely guarded vaults in Hollywood. Behind closed doors, however, the studio heads weren't blind. They knew exactly what kind of risk Cary posed. In an era when homosexuality wasn't just taboo but could ruin a career overnight, the mere suggestion was dangerous. If fans suspected that their matinee idol might not be the man of their dreams, ticket sales could plummet. So the studio executives doubled down. They arranged for Cary to be seen at the right places with the right women. Studio photographers staged candid shots of him escorting glamorous actresses to premieres. Publicists planted stories of whirlwind romances in magazines. Every photo, every headline, every carefully placed rumor was designed to build a fortress around his image. Even Randolph Scott, Cary's longtime companion, became part of the strategy. Rather than hiding their closeness, the studio spun it as harmless, two bachelors living together, enjoying the good life in Hollywood. The press dubbed them the gayest, meaning happiest bachelors in town. The subtext went unnoticed by most, but it was the perfect cover. The public saw friendship, not romance. But protection came at a cost. The studios demanded loyalty, and Cary often found himself caught between his own truth and the narrative written for him. He couldn't openly rebel, not without risking everything. So he played the game, smiling for cameras, posing with leading ladies, and letting the world believe he was exactly what the studios wanted him to be. The pressure took its toll. Friends recalled how Cary could swing from charming and lighthearted to deeply paranoid and withdrawn. He worried constantly about exposure, about one careless word or photograph shattering the facade. Every relationship he had was filtered through that fear. Could he trust this person? Or would they sell him out to the tabloids? The studio system thrived on that fear. It wasn't just Cary. Dozens of stars were locked into similar arrangements, their real lives buried beneath studio-crafted illusions. The machine didn't care about personal happiness. It cared about box office numbers. And Cary, with his perfectly sculpted image and undeniable screen presence, was too valuable to risk. By the late 1930s, Cary Grant had transformed into one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. Audiences adored him. Women wanted him, men admired him, but the truth of who he really was remained locked away, hidden behind studio deals, fake romances, and carefully controlled headlines. And the more successful he became, the higher the stakes grew. With every hit film, every magazine cover, every glowing review, Cary Grant's image became more untouchable, and his secret more dangerous. Because in Hollywood, the bigger the star, the bigger the fall. And Cary Grant was climbing to heights that no one, not even the men pulling the strings, could fully control. Cary Grant died in 1986, but his influence never faded. His films remain timeless, his image iconic, his name synonymous with stardom. Yet today, his story resonates in new ways. It reflects the cruelty of a system that demanded perfection but punished authenticity. It forces us to consider how many other lives were quietly broken under Hollywood's golden facade. And it reminds us that fame, success, and admiration mean little if you can't live truthfully. But Cary's legacy is also one of resilience. Despite the secrets, despite the toll, he gave the world performances that changed cinema forever. He brought elegance to comedy, depth to romance, and sophistication to the screen. Perhaps his greatest role was the one he played off-screen, navigating a world that wouldn't let him be fully himself, yet still leaving behind a legacy that endures. Cary Grant was more than a star. He was a man caught between two lives, the one Hollywood wanted, and the one he kept hidden. And maybe that's why his story still matters. Because it reveals not just who Cary Grant was, but what it truly cost to live in the shadows of perfection. Cary Grant's films are a joy to watch, but his life invites us to look deeper, beyond the glamour, and to remember the humanity behind the legend. What do you think? Was Cary Grant a master of survival in a cruel system, or was he a prisoner of his own fame? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more untold stories of Hollywood's most iconic stars, make sure to like, subscribe, and click the bell so you never miss what's coming next. Because sometimes, the biggest stories are the ones that were never meant to be told.